In You're watching India Today Global. Iran attacked Israel. The big question is Israel going to retaliate and how? To discuss the national security implications of what happened last night, I'm being joined by Shany Mor, who is a lecturer at Reichman University. Thank you so much, Shany, for joining us here on India Today Global. Uh, there, there are a lot of national security, foreign policy implications. As an expert, let's begin with what Israel's response is going to be like. We've seen an international spate of international reactions come in, all of them, most of them coming out in support of Israel. But what is the next course of action going to be for Netanyahu and his administration?
I obviously don't know what the next course of action will be. I can speculate on what it might be or what it could be or even what it should be. The comparison I would make is with the missile and there's a ballistic missile, cruise missile, and drone attack that Iran conducted 6 months ago in April. Last night's attack was just ballistic missiles. The results from the Iranian perspective are equally disappointing. They didn't manage to do very much damage, and they caused no fatalities on the Israeli side. And I'm not even sure there were actual injuries on the Israeli side either. Um, Nevertheless, having 200 ballistic missiles fired at your country and at almost all of its population centers and several major strategic targets as well is not something any country can simply tolerate or, as we were admonished 6 months ago, take the win on. The difference between now and April is that the international tolerance for Iranian adventurism is much lower than it was 6 months ago, largely because the admonishments to Israel for a restrained response then clearly have shown themselves to be largely ineffective. And more importantly, that the enormous strategic deterrent that the Iranians invested 30 years in constructing in Lebanon has been partially, maybe even largely dismantled in a stunning 9-day campaign that Israel conducted against Hezbollah in Lebanon. So that if 6 months ago there was global pressure on Israel not to react with anything more than a symbolic attack, and Israel was restrained out of fear of what Hezbollah might be able to do, today neither of those conditions is any more operative.
Well, you make a very important point on deterrence, Jenny. Let's just focus on that. And yes, when I asked you, I did mean what should Israel be doing as its next course of action. We'll discuss more on that. But on strategic deterrence, now, like you rightly said, there was a belief that should Israel act beyond Gaza Strip, that there is going to be a massive retaliation coming from the seventh front, which is the seventh front war we're talking about, which Israel faces. But looking at what has happened, has Israel managed to dismantle Iran's strategic deterrent, or is it that the deterrent itself was a myth?
That is something people are going to have to study for decades. I don't know yet if Israel has completely dismantled it. Yeah, Hezbollah still has roughly half of its missile and rocket arsenal that it had. It still is a potent ground force, and more importantly, it's still a threat in terms of global terrorist attacks outside of the Israeli-Lebanese theater. But as a state-like military force, it was quite foreboding as recently as 2 weeks ago, and today is not. It has lost its entire command and control structure. It's lost almost all of its senior leaders. And about half of its arsenal, including its ability to communicate internally. That's a massive blow. The Iranians had predicated their entire regional strategy on being able to employ Hezbollah to protect them. And last night, it was the Iranians themselves who had to try to make some kind of deterrent strike against Israel to protect what's left of Hezbollah. This is not how the Iranians planned on having this war unfold. It's not how they envisioned the outcome of such an enormous investment for a country without an enormous economic or diplomatic reserve, for an enormous and costly investment that has shown itself in the last 2 weeks to have been largely ineffective. I would even say wasteful.
Okay, but we're speaking to a few other security experts who focus on West Asia, and they're saying that while there has been Hezbollah has been absolutely or almost absolutely, near absolutely decimated, there can be a Hezbollah 2.0, and that there is going to be regrouping that has been seen in the past, in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. And in such a scenario, what is your reading of how badly destroyed or damaged is Hezbollah, or do they have the capability of regrouping and resurfacing?
I think they have the capability of regrouping and surfacing in the medium and term for sure. In the short term, they still are a formidable enemy in the territorial operation that Israel embarked on yesterday. Um, and as in any war, there will be surprises and disappointments and turns of events that are frustrating. Um, uh, the Israelis right now are mostly quite satisfied with how things have looked in the last 2 weeks. But as you remember, as recently as a month ago, there was a real atmosphere of despair here, particularly after the murder of the 6 Israeli hostages in Gaza. And that can still turn around for all sides in this conflict. Um, the bottom line, though, is that if the Iranians were counting on Hezbollah to make their nuclear sites and their key infrastructure sites immune to attack from Israel, that's no longer the case. And today, those places in Iran are vulnerable to Israeli attack in a way that their corresponding sites in Israel are not vulnerable to Iranian attack.
Okay. You spoke about how Iran has failed because they did not manage to penetrate the Iron Dome as much as they would have wanted to. We know that there was a lot of support from the American warship as well, and Israel managed to stave off most of the ballistic missiles. They couldn't manage to really cause real physical damage to infrastructure, as also loss of lives, because there weren't any. But Iran also officially, Shani, has said that they were not looking at attacking or causing loss of lives when it comes to civilians. So has Iran actually failed, or was that never their intent um, to cause casualties per se?
One doesn't fire 200 ballistic missiles at a tiny country without hoping to hit something or someone. Um, and in that sense, they failed. But I think the strategic failure is much bigger than the tactical failure of last night. Um, they have constructed this ring of fire around Israel, including Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, and sundry militias in Syria and Iraq. Um, they have been firing on all cylinders essentially since the 7th of October. And Israel has taken a massive hit in this war, but it has not actually collapsed in the way that they had envisioned or hoped. And in the meantime, 1 year on, um, the aspects of that strategy that were supposed to provide them the most forward defense um, are no longer operative.
Well, that's right. In this
I
seven
mean,
front
they're
war,
firing missiles which could do damage, didn't in this case, might in the future rounds. But for example, there's no Iranian airplane that can reach here. And Israel showed already in April that we have the capacity to reach them, hit a target, and come back safely to base.
that's quite significant, Shini. But you just spoke about the seven front war. You're talking about all fronts now open and Israel having to face threats from all quarters. In such a scenario, is Israel prepared? How prepared is Israel? And in terms of sustaining herself, how long can you sustain with or without external support?
Uh, Normally not very long. Israel is not built for long wars, not territorially, not economically, and not in terms of the unique diplomatic pressures that Israel faces in the international community. Um, so the most important thing for Israel to do in such a situation is to speed things up as much as possible. I mean,
Is
that's a general rule. It's not universally true. There are certain things that can only be won in attrition. example I have in mind, for example, is in the Second Intifada, which dragged on for almost 5 years. And ended, I think, with what we would acknowledge now is an Israeli victory and a Palestinian defeat. There was no real option for speeding that up.
Is November 5th the deadline? Are the US elections something that Netanyahu is considering as a deadline? That time is running out for Israel. Who comes to power?
I have no way of knowing. And he's the prime minister, but there's an entire national security apparatus that is a part of these decisions as well. I suspect also that the outcome of the election in the US will affect the decision-making of the Biden administration in the months between the election and the inauguration. The Biden administration will be one kind of administration after November 5th if it's planning on handing the keys over to Kamala Harris on January 20th.
Yes.
And it'll be a different kind of Biden administration after November 5th if it needs to be handing the keys to Donald Trump on January 20th.
Can you briefly tell us what it would mean if Kamala is in the White House and what it could mean should Trump come to power? Is there predictability there in what they could do and how they would look at Israel?
It's a bit hard to speculate. Trump's basic orientation in the region was for a stronger U.S. partnership with the Saudis. And interestingly, that was Biden's approach, even though it's not a traditionally democratic one, at least until October 7th as well. And Israel needs to figure out a way to fit itself into this American strategy. I don't know if Kamala Harris is as wedded to Biden's vision of the Middle East centered around an American-Saudi partnership that checks Iran and keeps China out. I suspect she's slightly less committed to it, but not in any dramatic way. And again, we'll see. But from the Israeli perspective, what happens after January 20th is probably less important even than what happens in the 3 months immediately before. And outgoing administration is always much freer to do whatever it wants, free of domestic pressures, often free of diplomatic pressures, and that can work in Israel's favor or against Israel. And as I suggested before, it looks very different if it's an outgoing administration handing over to its current VP rather than one that's handing over to what would essentially be the restoration of an administration that was quite detested by this White House, understandably.
Talking about the internal security also, Shany, you had two very important and serious incidents last night. One was the missile attack by Iran, but the other was the terror attack within. In terms of security, in terms of breaches, and in terms of concerns that the administration has and the country faces today, if you could just explain the threats and not just the threat perception that comes from within rather than outside of Israel.
Yeah. The terrorist threat is real. If anything, it's surprising that in the last year it's been so small, all things considered. The attack last night was one of the worst in a very long time. 7 people killed. Even the location of the attack, an area where there's so much mixing between Jews and Arabs, is surprising. I suspect that as the military fortunes of the various militias and countries arrayed against Israel continue to deteriorate, we might see more such terrorist attacks in Israel and against Israeli and Jewish targets abroad.
Okay.
And I would say as a side note that the attempts last night of the Minister for National Security to incite violence against the very large Muslim Arab community here in Jaffa, with no evidence that they had anything to do with this attack, the 2 terrorists were from Hebron, from the West Bank, was particularly shameful. Not his first attempt. And interestingly, over the course of a year since October 7th, he hasn't succeeded in creating any kind of internal violence between Arabs and Jews in Israel.
That's such an important point, Shani, that you make, because this is also an aspect that needs to be spoken of and talked about. Having very extreme viewpoints and ideas, or ministers with such viewpoints and ideas in the Netanyahu cabinet, how
I don't hear you
detrimental,
very well.
how
It's very
de-
hard to hear.
okay, having ministers with very extremist views and ideas in the Netanyahu cabinet. How detrimental has that been for Israel's own security and assuring that there is unity within the country? How detrimental has that really been?
Very detrimental. We have a very difficult war to fight in Gaza that on its own would already be extremely difficult. Hamas was a formidable enemy. Its network of tunnels was enormous. Its rocket capacity was huge. And this was always going to be a very difficult war. And then it had three additional burdens added onto it, making the conduct of the war more difficult than it already would be. The first and most important was the hostage situation. It's
Yes.
the fact of 200 some Israelis being taken hostage and being held in these Hamas tunnels that makes any kind of tactical advance much more difficult. The second one is the enormous hypocrisy of the international community and the various organs of self-styled international law or humanitarian nonsense that, in a very transparent way, um, essentially become objectively pro-Hamas and pro-Hezbollah forces. And the third one, the third burden, the unnecessary burden on this war effort, is the presence of extremist and far right figures in the Israeli government um, who often make the fight more difficult with pointless provocations on the goals of the war. And even, I'll give you an example. Um, the minister I mentioned earlier, the Minister of National Security, has made a big fuss of worsening the conditions of security prisoners. Um, Now, the one thing for a country like Israel in a war, the one we're in, we would love to fight the war on the in the arena where we have the advantage and not where we have the disadvantage. For example, if the entire war was being conducted in the air, that would be wonderful for us because we have one of the world's best air forces.
Yes.
We're at an enormous disadvantage if the war is being conducted in who can abuse prisoners more. We'll never be able to be as awful as the Hamas, ever. So why would any sane Israeli minister even enter that contest? He makes a big show of himself taking away baking privileges and all sorts of other and shower privileges of his prisoners, while we have 200 and now 100 hostages being held by Hamas in absolutely inhuman conditions under the ground.
Uh,
This makes no
has
sense. This is somebody who doesn't take national security very seriously.
But has Ben Gvir's position now, strengthened post the October 7th attacks and what we're seeing today? Because we did see him weaken a bit in the past, and his popularity was, he was not as popular.
Who's
Ben Gvir, the
oh, Ben?
Minister for National
Ah,
Security, including Netanyahu's.
so I
And
mean,
there was a lot of differences when it comes to having him in the government, him breaching the Al Aqsa Mosque, the compound, so on and so forth. Um, uh, there are so many instances that we can spell out on what he was doing wrong before the attacks. But has his position now strengthened? Is it now, has it become more far right extremist in terms of how the people are viewing? Because we see the popularity increase of not just Netanyahu, but maybe of also the national security minister.
right. So I think the far right, which usually gets around 10%, maybe slightly more in the vote totals recently at least, is probably going to get something similar. I don't think they've particularly strengthened or weakened. The right wing and religious coalition as a whole is significantly weakened since the last election in 2022. There's probably an uptick following the tactical successes of the last 2 weeks, but basically the coalition that is today on 64 mandates in the Knesset out of 120. In the most flattering opinion polls, barely makes it up to 49. That's not going to be easy for them to change going towards an election, which is why they resist so much having an early election.
Okay. Now, before I let you go, there are two very important areas that I'd like you to focus on. One is the assassinations, the killings of various top leadership, whether it's the Hamas or Hezbollah. And then we hear of reports of the Ayatollah being moved to a safe place. Is Iran rattled? While we were talking about deterrence, no deterrence, but is Iran actually rattled with what's happening? And do they think that it's the Ayatollah's turn next?
I have no way of knowing that. I don't know.
Okay. The other.
I can speak to the strategic question. They're certainly rattled by having lost a massive investment that didn't turn out for them. They, their entire posture is based on the idea that the Lebanese will be the ones defending Iran. And last night it was Iran that had to come and defend their Lebanese client militia, and that must be, at a minimum, very disappointing for them.
Finally, also a very important aspect of this entire war strategy and how Israel is looking at going in or not going in has also been to fight not just the militia on the ground, but also underground. And I'm talking about the tunnel system here. We've looked at tunnels in Gaza. We're also looking at tunnels here in Lebanon. That there's a massive tunnel infrastructure that helps them move weapons. In such a scenario, how do you think the Israeli forces can really advance into going into Lebanese territory, the ground force invasion that they're talking about? What's that purpose? What's the purpose going to be? What's it going to look like? And are they really focusing on the tunnels over here?
If I knew what tactics we had developed to defeat Hezbollah in the tunnels, I still wouldn't share it. So, but luckily I don't know.
No, I'm not talking about what strategy I'm saying, but is that the focus? Because that really has been one of the biggest challenges for Israel, given that they've used these underground strategies to ensure they have movement of weapons, movement of basic supplies that they require, and it is not done on land, but is done underground.
Sure. I mean, the tunnels have a very different significance in Lebanon than they do in Gaza because of a very different topography, rocky and mountain, and rather than the flat sand expanse that is Gaza. And Israel in its war with Hezbollah will try to do what a smart belligerent does in any war, which is fight in the places where it has the tactical advantage and avoid getting dragged into the places where its enemy has the advantage. Hezbollah may have built a lot of tunnels, but we managed in 9 days to completely destroy their communication system and decapitate the organization and eliminate all of its commanders of its elite force.
Shany, in your assessment, is this going to be a prolonged war? Because if now Iran is in the fray, we are looking at American support. Do you, in your assessment, look at Russia-China intervention? And should that come about, is this a very long war, a long-drawn war that we're looking at?
Again, I have no way of knowing, and I have no predictive powers on these things. I think that this is a hot phase of a very long struggle and a very long conflict. That hot phase could be more or less protracted, but the clash of interests here between the US-aligned axis and the Iranian one is a permanent feature unless and until the Islamist regime in Iran falls.
Shany Mor, thank you so much for joining us here on India Today Global.
Thank you for having me.